You are listening to the Kelly Confidential podcast with Kelly Wilkes. This is episode 23. Welcome to the Kelly Confidential Show, where we talk negotiation essentials and those crucial conversations empowering extraordinary women. Real women, real issues. Let's jump in. Welcome back, friends. Thanks for being here. How are you? How was your break? We're just back from Cumbria in the north of England. The peaks of Cumbria, also known as the Lake District, are as close to mountains as I'm going to get in this country, let's face it. But wow, do they pack a punch. It was so beautiful. I especially loved Brigsteer Brow, which is one of the peaks with its uninterrupted 360-degree views. It was just remarkable. It was beautiful. And yeah, I'm back and totally ready to tackle 2024 and whatever else life has in store for me this year. Exciting. And now, as I was thinking about this episode, I thought, okay, we need to think about what is our starting point. And you can't really look to your starting point without looking at where you've come from. And so this episode is going to be a bit of a ride, but just stick it out because I think it will all make sense. And we're going to cover a little bit of politics, some environmental thoughts, and I'm even going to talk about the Hunger Games movie and the women of Iceland. This show is loaded today, but it all hangs together with the same theme. So buckle in and let's get going. Hey everyone. So before we dive in, I wanted to check in on really how you're all doing. And I guess it's an ask for you to ask yourself the same thing. How are you doing? And use this time in this episode to reflect as you're listening. And I don't know where you're listening. You might be at home doing chores, running to the groceries. Maybe you're at the gym. Maybe you're out for a walk. Those are all the places that I typically like to listen to my podcasts. And I just want you to take a moment and reflect on where you're at, how you're feeling, and hold on to those thoughts as we head into some of these topics. And I don't know about you, but I was so relieved to shut off for a few days and take a break from screens and social media, and also to have a break from the news. The news has been a bit tough lately, hasn't it? I'm a bit of what you might call a news junkie. I normally really enjoy checking out the news from different sources, different countries. And I like to stay on top of politics, business, etc., as I think you all know. And I have a few apps that beep at me. And the news is kind of an important part of my life. And I think it's important to know what's going on in the world and not take it for granted, and not just believe that what's happening in your backyard captures the entirety of what's happening in the world. I think it's important that we look further than that and understand what's happening. But the news, I think for the last couple of months have been pretty tough to take. And as we were climbing the hills in Cumbria, I kept thinking about this, about how heavy the last few months have felt and how that made me feel and how much I've taken to hiding from the news lately, like really avoiding it. On my phone, I've been closing down the apps and I've totally been avoiding it on cable and on the internet. Anyway, so while I was there up the peaks of Cumbria in that truly serene setting with all of the pines and the rocky climbs and the beautiful ground mosses, which are just so colorful and unlike anything I've seen before. And all the wildlife. I was, daydreaming, as you would expect to do on these sort of mountainous hikes. And I was thinking about the upcoming courses I'm running and new episodes I wanted to share and all of the really great things women could achieve this year. But I couldn't help but reflect on how the past few months had produced some of the most harrowing, anxiety-provoking, and really awful news stories coming out of various parts of the world. And that kept bringing me back to earth with a depressing bump. And I thought, you know what? There's no avoiding this. And while I'd love to approach the return from holidays like any good clean out and just kind of chuck those thoughts out, some of this we simply can't throw in the bin because it's just so entrenched in our cultures. And some of the things that have been happening in the world over the last couple months are just so big that it's almost irresponsible to not talk about it. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the person that buries my head in the sand. So we need to face the crap we don't like, and we need to deal with it. Because there's 0 point in investing in all of those New Year's resolutions and positive manifestations if there's a steaming pile of poo in your way blocking your path ahead. Sorry for the graphic, but I think it really captures what I'm trying to get at. We can't ignore these things, and I also think it's unhealthy to ignore them. I think the anxiety gets absorbed by us. And it doesn't just dissipate, right? So I think we need to be talking about it with our friends and our families and trying to unpack, what does this all mean? What is it telling us? So before we can get to building all the positive good stuff we want to work on, we have to face the things we don't like, talk about those things, share in our common goals, and try to shed some of these negative thoughts, or they will absolutely weigh us down. So today's episode is one of reflection about what's happening around us and where women are in today's society as a snapshot. That's such a huge topic. I obviously would not be able to do that justice in a mere episode, but we're going to just take a pulse check on what these big events over the last couple of months are telling us about women's position in society and what we can interpret from that. We need to reflect on the measure of our power and influence, and also why we must absolutely keep pressing for more representation, more influence, more capital wealth, more power, and ultimately more say in what happens to us and in the world around us. And these things, they're not nice to haves, right? We must stop treating equity, the need for true gender balance, as a luxury or something that we need to earn. It should instead be a de facto standard, both genders treated with the same, in every way, same balance. And because it isn't balanced, and the consequences of this imbalance are so devastating to the health, well-being, and prosperity for millions of women and their daughters around the world, especially in developing nations, we must press harder, push ourselves further, learn more, earn more, and talk more about what we need to close the gap. But first, when and why did I stop watching the news recently? Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So late October, I think it was, when my senses really couldn't take any more of really the horrors happening between Israel and Gaza. And I think irrespective of your politics, and I'm not going to get into who's right and who's wrong here, I think irrespective of politics, the absence of humanity on both sides, and then the continued torrent of bombings raining down on the people of Gaza has been difficult to stomach, because at what point do you determine that it's enough? And we don't know, do we? We're not in control of this. We're just spectators to something really terrible happening. And it's hard to find the words to describe the despair and sense of helplessness these news updates can generate in a person. So it's unimaginable what families are feeling on the ground there. And that's a lot. That's a lot for all of us to take in and hold. And where do those feelings go? And adding to these news updates were reports over the past 2 months that the Ukraine still had some distance to go in reclaiming its country, while we were getting word from various government authorities that, really critical funding from allies was starting to run out. And again, difficult to imagine what the Ukrainian people, might be feeling, and what does that look like if that were to become a reality and the resources and the protection was to stop. So, and then we have, of course, the anchoring of all of these things by the unfolding political campaigns that are both expected in the US and in the UK, which I think will be fought bitterly and skeptically over the next several months. And so that's, I think, weighing on a lot of people as well. And then to the backdrop of all of those news stories was the highly criticized gathering of the COP28 climate conference that took place late November, early December in the UAE, where a BBC expose leaked that the head of the conference and other oil barons were taking advantage of access to the captive audience there of global leaders and their delegates to solicit new fossil fuel deals. And to say UN organizers and the general public were outraged is, an understatement. And I think this last story about COP28 is especially noteworthy because the work that the United Nations is doing in climate and social matters is so important. And they're expected to do important things. The world sent the best and the brightest minds in science, politics, financing to figure out how to balance the climate issue. Sent all of these folks off to COP28 and to try and figure out how to enable countries to continue to make revenues, grow their GDP while reducing devastating carbon emissions and microplastics. This is difficult. This is a complex problem, especially if you're a country whose primary exports are fossil fuels, right? So how do you make all of this work ethically and, with balance so that these countries can continue to thrive and move forward? So I get it. This is difficult, but don't be shady about it. And I think that's where folks felt quite jaded and cynical about the COP conferences. And it's all so depressing and despairing. All of the injustice and the imbalance in these topics and the outcomes of the decisions influencing these topics. I didn't vote for any of this. But we're somehow roped into these scenarios like very unhappy passengers trapped on a train together. I mean, talking about Gaza alone, I was chatting with my best friend about this, and she lives thousands of miles away from me. And we both felt the same thing. We watch different news outlets, we talk to different people, we read different newspapers, and yet we were both so upset by what we were seeing. And I don't know a single female who is willingly watching the daily news coverage of this any longer. It's just so heartbreaking. And why? Well, because nothing in those politics makes sense to a woman, I don't think. I don't know any woman that feels okay with this. I don't care what your politics are. No woman I know would willingly bomb the hell out of a place full of civilians with families, advance warning or not. you know, reason to do it or not. You just don't go after civilians and their families. It just doesn't make sense as a strategy to resolve conflict, right? Where is it meant to end? And it got me thinking about the common denominator in all of these scenarios. Every one of these scenarios has something in common influencing these decisions. Can you guess it? In every single issue I've laid out here, the balance of power in these governments or government bodies, even within the UN, is overwhelmingly, and I don't mean a little bit, I mean overwhelmingly male. This is not a controversial statement. This is an observation of fact. The decisions being made about Gaza are being directed by men. The individuals orchestrating the structure, the invitee list, the side deals to sell more drilling licenses at COP28 were driven predominantly by male decision makers. The choice to continue to brutalize the Ukraine is led by a male dictatorship. The pressure to support Israel while simultaneously slowing funding in Ukraine is being led by the 72% male-dominated U.S. Congress. And it made me think of this powerful scene from The Hunger Games that was playing out on TV just before Christmas. I've seen the film a few times. It was Jennifer Lawrence's breakout role, I think. And it's just such a remarkable story and such a superbly directed film. Disturbing, of course, but so much social messaging to take from it. The Hunger Games trilogy is based on the books by Suzanne Collins, and it has a just terrific cast in Jennifer Lawrence, Liam Hemsworth, the brilliant late Philip Seymour Hoffman, whom I love, loved him, and Donald Sutherland, who plays the chilling bad guy President Snow. I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock to not have heard about these films. It's of the same fame as Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and so forth. The story is set in a dystopian future where the children of impoverished villages are rounded up and forced to fight to the death in a bid for TV ratings and, of course, power. It's almost impossible to not watch this film. The first film in the trilogy especially, just so extraordinary and troubling and captivating all at the same time. I've probably seen it about 5 times over the years, and it never fades in its ability to fully, just captivate me. And while the story is disturbing, it's familiar, right? The parallels and the pointed morality questions are hard to ignore. It's like Lord of the Flies meets its future self in a glamorous ratings-based social media future, where the stakes are the same, but projected to an exponential audience, where instead of fighting each other from desperate starved conditions, these brutal games purposefully pit the children against each other, where there is only one victor. The person who kills all other competitors wins fame, fortune, and some meager measure of freedom for their family. And so it was on TV just before Christmas, and I was struck again by the patriarchy and the misogynistic threads leading to the forced warfare amongst these desperate children. And it made me think of parallels in the struggles women face routinely in the home or workplace, and how often women are forced to diminish themselves, their ideas and talents, to maintain or raise the profile of those in control, especially in male-dominated politics and industries. Worse yet is when women are pitted against each other to somehow beat the other, to stand out, but not in a way that confronts the system. Does that make sense? It must be in complement to the system, or it loses some of its influence. But what then does that actually produce, if not like aggressive competition? And this is where you find your aggressive patriarchal female leaders, the shoulder pad brigade, I call them. And we see this metaphor play out in the children of the Hunger Games as they are forced into battle against each other. Total strangers who have nothing against each other, and they're forced into battle for survival. And in the lead up to the expected Hunger Games battle itself, the first and presumably only battle that the heroine Katniss Everdeen will compete in, each contestant is required to perform for the voting Congress with some form of talent such that they leave a positive impression on the judges, who in turn may show some mercy by granting resources to the contestants during the games in the form of things like medicines, food, items for a shelter, and so forth. And there's a superb scene where Katniss is ushered alone into a darkened gymnasium-type room where she's required to perform her talent, which in this case is archery. And to do this for the entertainment of the judges who are observing this from a club-level room above the gymnasium where they are mingling, drinking, dining on rich, sumptuous-looking foods. And they chat, amiably, boisterously amongst each other with really very little regard for the young woman who's entered the room below them, which is Katniss. And there are two really noteworthy parts to this scene. First, the club level room is occupied solely by men. Then when you spot two women, their role is as a server. So it's all men, and then you have these two females in the club room with them, but they're the servers, passing out drinks and submissively tending to the needs of the males in the room. There are no females of power in Club Lounge. And then you see Katniss introduce herself nervously. She mentions the district she's representing, and she picks up her bow and aims for the target. She's got to put this show on for them. And she aims and she releases the arrow, but she misses the target. The men pause briefly to watch, and then they laugh at her for missing the shot before they return to their feast and their merriment, and as if it never even happened, right? And she's just stood there. And, she's a skilled markswoman, and she's embarrassed by her mistake. And so she decides she's taking another shot. She doesn't hesitate. She loads her arrow. And this time she hits the target dead center, full bullseye. But there's no acknowledgement from up above. So unimpressed by her first failing that these guys had turned their back on her and they missed this exceptional shot entirely. Their focus was instead on their jokes, the backslapping, the camaraderie, and the golden roasted pig presented to them for their feast. And watching this, it's easy to feel angry and disappointed for her. But as a woman, it's also a familiar feeling, isn't it? Does that make sense? And then the scene continues. Katniss, takes on a sort of steely resolve and reloads her bow and aims straight a third time, her focus squarely at the target. But at the last flash of a minute, she changes her aim 90 degrees and thwack, shoots her arrow straight through the apple in the pig's mouth. It is sublime. Of course, it catches the judge's attention, and later it garners her a complete telling off by her mentoring team. But it earns the respect of thousands of generous fans who hear about this, and they later reward her with resources during the battle. But President Snow, the chief architect of these barbaric games and tyrannical ruler of Panem, reflects on Katniss Everdeen's apple-piercing theatrics and challenges his second-in-command, called Seneca, for giving her these high marks and praising this. And when Seneca looks confused, President Snow reminds him why they must have the competition and why they must have a winner. Well, why? Asks Seneca. Hope, says President Snow. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. And these words are just chilling. Have you seen the film? What do you think of that scene? The whole storyline is thought-provoking, and it's really sobering in its metaphors. And hope is so important, especially when we're not as far along as we think we are. We need to have hope to galvanize our energies when we're feeling low or minimized or oppressed, so we can turn that energy into education and positive, productive, lasting change. I was talking to another friend a couple weeks ago about how frustrating it is to see the statistics on women's position in power, capital wealth, and political access, and how little they've moved. And I remember saying to her that many of these stats hadn't, in fact, changed much in the past 2 decades. And I found that my estimates were correct. When I recently came across the UN's 2023 Gender Index report, which was published in June, and I only came across it this last week. And I've included the link to the full report in my show notes. This annual report is so good, and I've made citations from the 2021 and 2022 reports, and I've, in fact, used them a couple times in my teaching and also in my previous episodes. And then the whole aim of this report is to chart, catalog, and measure gender differences across all areas of power, education, capital wealth, social issues, including domestic abuse, and general bias. And the report this year, gosh, it's just pretty damning. In fact, it's downright depressing, but it's important that we talk about it. So let's jump in. According to the journalist's editorial opening of the report's release, they said bias against women is as entrenched as it was a decade ago, and gender equality progress has gone into reverse, with 9 out of 10 people of all genders holding a bias against women, a figure which is unchanged since 2013. Further, the report found that half of people in 80 countries surveyed believe men make better political leaders. 40% surveyed believe that men make better business executives. And 25% of countries surveyed believe it is justified for men to beat their wives. Here are some additional decanted findings across the 80 countries polled. 27% believe that women having the same rights as men is essential for democracy. That means 73% don't believe that. 28% believe that going to university is more important for men than women. 46%, that's nearly half of the countries polled, both genders, remember, believe that men should have more rights to a job than a woman. And a staggering 50% of people polled believe that men should have a proxy say over women's reproductive rights. That is, the majority of people polled believe that men should have a proxy say over women's reproductive rights. But where it counts the most is in the position of power and influence. And page 11 of the report showed that globally, women remain underrepresented at the highest levels of political office, which is really the cause of all of this. You can only change the laws from the top down. You can advocate for, and you can lobby for, and you can rally for from the bottom up, but the laws can only be changed at the top, and they trickle down into the nations and the communities and the villages. So it's incredibly important to have representation in the highest levels of power and political office. And what this United Nations report is telling us in 2023 is that less than 10% of the countries polled across 80 countries have at least one woman in executive political office. So over 90% of the countries polled, over 90% of the countries polled have no women at all in their highest political office. That disturbed me so much. I mean, you get the gist of it. And I've included the link to the full report in my show notes. And amidst all of this crushing data, the tiny nation of Iceland shot its metaphorical arrow through the pig's mouth. What do they do? Well, I'm about to tell you. If you haven't heard about this, you have been missing out. And I meant to do a whole episode actually dedicated to this because I was so chuffed when I saw this. This was actually one of the golden moments in October's news updates that I thought was worthy of reading amid all of the other horrible things happening in October and November. But it was such a delight to read this. On the 24th of October, 50 years to the day they first did it, thousands of women of Iceland went on strike and walked out on their jobs. In fact, it's estimated that between 70 and 100,000 women walked out on the job on that day to raise awareness, to push for equal pay and equal treatment at home. And I should mention that there are only 300,000 people in Iceland, so roughly a third of the country, including their female prime minister, walked out on the job for an entire day of unpaid work to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with the slow pace of gender equality. Some schools, banks, medical clinics, libraries had to close or provide deeply reduced services, so short of staff they were. And it's also worth mentioning that 2/3 of Iceland's cabinet is female. That's right, 66% of their senior political office, their cabinet, is 66% is female. And they too walked out for the day. And just for comparison's sake, the UK Parliament has 35% female representation, while the United States Congress has yet to ever break a third, with a mere 28% female representation. And Iceland is rated number 1 in the world by the World Economic Forum for being the most gender equal. And they still, took a stand and said, we need to do more. Again, by contrast, the UK is at number 14, Canada is at number 30, the US trails some distance behind at number 43, which is just embarrassing, really. But the message from Iceland, it just is so powerful, and it's so inspiring, and its impact is significant to women and girls well beyond its borders. It's a message of tenacity and hope. And so I come back to the topic of Gaza and the Ukraine, and of COP28 and society's general handling of the climate crisis, which of course is in the hands of the national governments in each country, which, according to the survey, are over 90% male-led. And I wondered, what would it look like in Gaza, in the Ukraine, and at the COP28 negotiation table if these leaders had been female? What would that look like? The answer to those thoughts lies in how long we accept the gap. The only way to close the gap is to increase education, increase exposure, representation, and for women to want more, to demand more, to choose more, and to become better negotiators. It's absolutely essential. Closing the gap, one deal at a time. Happy New Year. Let's make 2024 powerful together. And that's us for today. And stay tuned, as I've got a great new lineup of fierce female guests coming over the next few months to share business ideas, career insights, and ways to leverage your power and keep it high. And I'm also developing an immersive 4-day, 3-night learning experience this fall And I'm wondering, what do you think about that? I'm pretty pumped about it. I'm getting things into place. It's designed specifically for all you fierce females out there who are ready to take your career or your business to the next level and need sharp negotiation skills to make it happen. So drop me a line if you think that's something you'd be interested in. And for now, thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, give us a like or leave a review and follow us. Until next time.